One of the tensions in parenting, I find, is walking the line between making sure that my kids are protected and safe and that I'm not being a responsible parent, and also giving them the freedom and the opportunity and the joy of trying and playing and taking a risk and learning what boundaries are and finding all of that out in a spirit of exploration and self trust, right? It's a hard line to walk. When my kids were toddlers, that line usually showed up when we were playing, let's say, outside in the woods and they're crawling on an old tree that's fallen down in the forest. And there's like branches that are sticking out that all I can do is imagine them like hurting them and them falling and something horrible happening. And this deep, deep primal instinct comes up in me to try to like overcorrect, right? This over caution, this tight, fear-based, negative way of seeing their childhood. Now that my students are older, sorry, now that my kids are older, there's like a middle school version that's starting to arise or an older kid version, right? So whether it's a group chat or a hangout, or there's other terrains, right, where I imagine branches sticking out that feel sharp, that might hurt if I'm not there to make sure that they do everything, right, as safely as they possibly can. There is a danger in over caution. There is a danger in trying to protect or make sure that everything is just so before we do anything or try anything. There is a danger in over caution. There is a danger in being afraid to say an opinion, an idea, to try something, to do an experiment, to respond with our instincts and what our gut says might be true in our context and our situation. And one thing I find is that there's a similar vibe when we're on these fault lines in teaching, when we are talking about things that feel like they have sides or binaries or extreme. And one thing I find is that there's a similar vibe when we are talking about debates or fault lines in education and teaching. There's an over caution, I find, when anyone brings up an idea that doesn't necessarily check every box for every situation that a teacher might find themselves. There is usually someone who's going to say, well, be careful. Well, hold on. Well, wait a bit. What about, right? And this is good. This is a good thing because the stakes are high. And I am not saying that we should just have a try anything you want, it doesn't matter, right? Relax, everything's cool. Because, of course, everything's not cool for a lot of kids in our schools and a lot of kids in our classrooms. There are a lot of things that aren't happening for students that need to happen. We know this. Teachers know this more than anybody, right? That we're not necessarily meeting the needs of all our students in a given moment in our teaching. It is something that the teachers I work with, who I respect deeply, worry about endlessly, like a parent. But teaching and learning is about trying. It's about iterating. It's about feeling empowered to respond to students, to respond to what we think might work based in our own understanding of our subject matter, of pedagogy, of all the stuff that we talk about on here. Like, you want to say that teaching is a science, that reading is a science, that writing is a science, that learning is a science, that listening is a science, that everything is the science of. If you want to say that, I'm down. But teaching is about taking that science and playing. You want to say that teaching is a science, that learning is a science, that it's all a science? Fine. But you know what else it is? An art. And art requires oxygen, requires openness, requires risk, requires mess, requires mistakes. Oh, wait, science does too. A few weeks ago, I wrote a Substack essay called Old Dog, Old Tricks. And I made an argument for remembering of some of the ways that we used to approach, particularly literacy, before a lot of the recent changes in curriculum and teaching and everything. And in that essay, I argue that some of the old ways that I saw teachers approach literacy, that I approached literacy in the classroom, I think would be really valuable to bring back. And one thing I noticed is that right away, there was some response, not just to me, there's other people who've been arguing what I have either as well as I did or better or worse, whatever, but that there's, people who responded to people like me who are saying like, hey, should we reflect and look back on some of these old methods or ways of approaching this work that might help? And what I noticed was it almost appeared like a willful misinterpretation of the premise of that argument, that most people, when they were pushing back against a remembering of the old ways, took a kind of straw man approach and made it about chalkboards or paper and pencils or handwriting or paper books or something that was so I would say even absurd, right? To think that that is what a thinking educator would mean right now, that what we need is to return to only handwriting for all kids or only blackboards or whiteboards or take away all screens from the classroom. And I find that kind of arguing disingenuous because it gets away from looking at what maybe an older approach to literacy, a more analog approach to literacy might be that isn't so screen heavy. Because as I argue in that essay, when I talk about old ways, I'm talking about something like this. So this list I will put a photo of. It's also in the Substack. What do you call them? Blogs, articles, essays? Yeah, the Substack thing. And it's not actually what I want to talk about here. But what I do want to talk about is one example of how I think this way of being overcautious, of always correcting when someone says an opinion about pedagogy or method or the way maybe we should approach a certain problem in teaching, seems to tend to go, that I think creates a kind of overcautious atmosphere. Even though, again, we always want to be aware of what we're doing, who it's affecting, who it's working for, who it's not. But if we could just agree on that, which is why I wrote and recorded the video the last time, that if we could just agree that the whole point of teaching should be to try to meet kids where they are as much as we can while holding them to high standards and having clear goals, if we could just agree on that, then we could start to just debate in a useful way the different ways that we should approach that, as opposed to correcting each other and being overcautious. Let me give you a really concrete example. So a while ago, I recorded a strategy video on a lesson I teach a lot, where we look at relationships using something called the relationship continuum, which is just a graphic organizer that helps students to both track and trace a character's relationship development over time, and to help them think about maybe some more precise language to describe that relationship along the way. Fine. In that video, I wrote it on the chalkboard here and used that as just my visual for these videos. And someone asked in the comments where students should record that work. Should they use a notebook or should they use a graphic organizer? And here's what's interesting about that question to me, is that I noticed that that question, should students write more authentically longhand handwriting in a notebook and collect their notes over time? Should they have like a packet of worksheets or graphic organizers or templates that they can fill out so that they have sort of a structure just to lean into? Should they be doing this on the devices, or is it handwriting? Like, what is the right way? And I find that this topic is another fault line where people, pretty innocuous ones, sort of, but people have the same response of overcaution regardless of what you choose. So you go ahead and you choose a notebook, and your students are going to handwrite notes authentically over time. And so you teach a lesson like the relationship continuum, and you ask students to copy that down in their notebooks in their own way, or make their own versions of it, what have you. And there will be people who will come and tell you, rightly so, that, some kids really need, there's research that supports that some kids, I'll put it in the comments, really need a sort of running jump, right? That structure, that organizational form that's handed to them, that they don't have to copy and use cognitive load to sort of like get that part done. That is going to really help them to get the actual thinking and analytical work that you're asking them to do down, right? And so you'll be like, oh no, okay, I hear that. I'll print out some graphic organizers and I'll hand them to the kids and I'll make them do it on that. And maybe they can even just tape it into their notebook if I want to use a notebook. And then someone will come in and be like, well, the research suggests that handwriting and longhand note taking is just vastly superior. And so, being able to do the thinking work of like, how should these notes be on the page is part of the analysis. And you're taking that from kids. If you give them a graphic organizer, how can you do that to them? And so you go like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'll take that away and I'll go back to handwriting. And you see the merry-go-round goes around and around. And so this is a very small example of what I think happens often on these fault lines, these debates, these questions we have in teaching, is that we want it to be a science. We want there to be a right answer. And when we get into that frame of mind, what winds up happening is I bring up my research study, you bring up your research study, we have battle of the celebrity deathmatch research studies, and what we don't have are practitioners, teachers, talking about what is working for which students and how do you know? How do you know? Because of course, you know where I'm going. Excuse me. You know where I'm going. That is the answer. The answer is that it depends, that some students, the research seems to suggest, I'll put it in the comments, that most students do better with handwriting, like long form, just writing, that notebooks might be better for most students. And yet there is a lot of research that suggests that of course that's not true for all students. And many, many students are going to need or benefit from the support of a template that they can fill in that's already done for them. And so we find ourselves in a place where, again, I find myself as an educator quite often, where the answer isn't one thing or the other, that we aren't talking about right and wrong, because these things aren't actually only a science, even though science has so much to teach us about what we do. That because it's not about right and wrong, do this, not that, it means that we have to put things in balance, which I know is a word no one wants to say anymore. And yet that's still always going to be a part of teaching, is trying to figure out who needs this, who needs that, how much of this, how much of that. I've never seen a classroom that hasn't had to grapple with teaching in that framework of finding a balance between things that fit the kids in front of us. And the thing about balance is that balance isn't about one way or the other, one side or the other. Balance isn't about right or wrong. And balance also isn't about everybody getting the same thing or everybody having the same, equal amounts. Like I have a notebook and graphic organizers and you have, like, we all have this, it's just balanced even. You know what I'm talking about. You get the image, right? Balance isn't about everything being the same. Balance is about getting our bearings. Balance is about finding the right way. Think about the last time you tried to find balance. I just did a little yoga over the weekend and I was trying to do a downward facing dog and I have kind of a bum ankle right now. And I found that I couldn't do downward facing dog putting equal pressure on both feet. That would not have been balanced for me. That in fact, I had to adjust to be a little uneven, even to find a support like a block in order to do it, right? Balance isn't about things being the same or equal all the time. Balance is about finding the place that gives us stability, that allows us to get enough foundation underneath us that we can press and move forward, if I extend the metaphor. I hope these are helpful discussions. I'm going to write this up as well. And let me know if there's any other fault lines you want me to talk about. Thanks.